Well, good morning, class. I hope you enjoyed the last week's lecture on social information processing theory. You got to hear from someone else besides me, and some of your TAs are experts in that particular approach, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about Joe Walther. I hope you also had the opportunity to view the video interview between M. Griffin and Joe Walther, perhaps in your recitation section. But if you have not viewed that video, I do advise you to go in and look at the video interviews and listen to that very interesting interview between M. Griffin and Joe Walther. Joe Walther was almost a Purdue professor. We tried to recruit him here, and he is now in Singapore. He moved to Michigan State briefly, but is now in Singapore. Very interesting fellow, and a lot of interesting ideas about computer-mediated communication and how we use technology to communicate with each other. Today, we are going to be talking about a very different kind of theory, the communication privacy management theory. We typically think, and we've been talking about relational development, both in the interpersonal context and using social media to develop relationships. In this theory, we're really talking about, instead of sharing information in a deliberate way to develop relationships, this theory talks about deliberately withholding information for privacy purposes. So there are often tensions in our communication situations where we are bound not to share information, not to advance our relationships by becoming more intimate, but by actually withholding information. And the theorist in this particular case is Sandra Petronio. Sandra Petronio is right down the road from us at IUPUI, and I had the opportunity a little bit ago to go down and interview her for one of our video interviews, and you will see that interview today. But she was the spouse of the former chancellor at IUPUI, Chuck Bantz, who was also in communication. He has now moved on. And Sandra Petronio may be about the business of shifting to retirement mode. I don't know exactly what her plan is. But she has contributed this theory, communication privacy management. And it really, I have to be honest with you, it's not the easiest theory to present as a formal theoretical framework that has particular predictions or particular values to espouse. But I think that the theory has been very widely used in our field. In fact, I think that if you took a survey of communication research over the past decade, you would find that this theory, communication privacy management theory, is one of the most frequently invoked theories in our literature. And it has been used literally as a framework in hundreds of studies. And I think that there's a good reason for that. I think that it was one of the first theories to provide a vocabulary for talking about privacy issues. So if you go back to the more interpretive theoretical schemes, you know that one of the purposes of an interpretive theory is to provide a framework for description, to emphasize description. And this particular theory has really provided a descriptive vocabulary for talking about privacy issues. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has become such a popular theory. The central concept in this theory is sometimes referred to as a map. The theory is sometimes referred to as a map of the way people navigate privacy. And the central concept is the privacy boundary. That boundary then contains information that you have, but others don't know. And my guess is that right now, many of you are sitting on information that only you know, but others don't know. I'm going to ask just for a show of hands, and Doug, if you want to stop the lecture at this point and just talk briefly about this. I'm wondering how many of you right now, sitting in the lecture hall, are privy to some piece of private family information. That is something that is going on in your immediate family that you know about, but there are other people in your family, in your immediate family, either your parents or siblings, who do not know that information, and you feel bound not to share that information, or you know that if you did share it, it would cause some kind of difficulty or tension or problematic dynamic in the family. If you would just raise your hand if you feel like you are in that situation. And Doug, if you want to stop the lecture at this point and just kind of comment on the show of hands here, usually when I ask this question, it turns out that it is quite common that a number of you are in this situation where you have information that you regard as private that you are trying to protect, and that if you did share it with somebody in the family, you might realize that there would be some problematic consequences for that. Well, that's a very uncomfortable situation to be in, and it's one that comes with responsibility that we will talk about. I am also wondering, along the same line then, how many of you are willing protectors of that private information, and how many of you would rather not even know about it and have to deal with it? So raise your hand if you're in that second category. How many of you have this private information, but if you had a choice, you would rather not even know about it, and you do not appreciate the obligation that you are under to protect this private information from other members of your family? How many of you are in that situation? Okay, so Doug, you can comment on that if you want to, but I think that if this class is typical of past classes, it's probably the case that many of you are in that situation. And as you may know, it's not the best situation to be in. Now, we've talked about self-disclosure in relational development, and Sandra Petronio does not like the term self-disclosure. Instead, she would rather use the term disclosure of private information. Now, of course, one reason she uses that term instead is because her theory is about privacy management. But she really prefers to talk about disclosure of private information instead of self-disclosure for a number of different reasons. First of all, she says, much of what we disclose is not self-disclosure. It is not about ourselves. It is about other people. And so you probably are aware that you sometimes talk to your friends, and you're not sharing information about yourself as much as you are sharing information about other people. And that, of course, would mean that you're not self-disclosing so much as you're disclosing about somebody else. And that's one reason why Petronio prefers to talk about disclosure of private information. She also says that self-disclosure implies intimacy. So when we talked about social penetration theory and sharing information with other people to become more intimate, Petronio says that that emphasis on intimacy is perhaps misplaced. Self-disclosure implies intimacy, but she says there are other reasons to disclose information that do not necessarily result in the formation of intimacy. You may know people who seem to enjoy simply being the one to share private information. They have some information that other people don't have, and they simply like to share it because it may put them in a position socially that causes them to think that they are more important than the other people in the group or whatever. But it's not necessarily about building intimacy, but it's about sharing that information for other reasons. So these are the reasons Petronio prefers to talk about disclosure of private information rather than self-disclosure. She also says that, and let me make sure I'm on the right slide here. She also says that self-disclosure, disclosure of private information has a more neutral feel than self-disclosure. So self-disclosure we generally associate with sort of the warm fuzziness of intimacy, and disclosure of private information does not have that sort of feeling to it. It has a much more neutral feeling, and she prefers that. She prefers to talk about that neutral feeling as opposed to the warm, fuzzy feeling. So that's another reason that she emphasizes this. And finally, she says that self-disclosure focuses on a unilateral act of the disclosure, of the disclosure. So it's not so much self-disclosure we typically think of as a mutual relationship developing activity where people are mutually self-disclosing in order to grow that relationship, whereas self-disclosure is not so much oriented along that line. It's a unilateral act of the disclosure. The discloser chooses to reveal a bit of information, a secret of some sort, and she just thinks that this is a more appropriate way to talk about revealing information. The central concept, again, in this theory is the privacy boundary. The privacy boundary contains information that you have, but others do not know. Now, when you talk about privacy boundaries, one of the vocabulary terms that Petronio uses in the theory to talk about these boundaries is the thickness or the thinness of the boundary. So a privacy boundary can be thin and porous, or it can be thick and dense. You may know some people in your life who you would describe as people who simply cannot keep a secret. If you entrust them with private information, just as sure as anything, you can count on the fact that they are going to go blab that information to somebody else almost immediately. Those people would have what we would call a very thin and porous privacy boundary. Information goes right through them like a sieve. On the other hand, you may know people who are extremely trustworthy with private information that you can trust not to share. If they give you your word, their word that they are not going to share that information, you know that they're not. Their privacy boundary is very thick and dense, and they will not reveal that information to anyone. So Petronio finds this to be a useful way of talking about privacy boundaries and the nature of privacy boundaries. Now, the theory really can be presented, I think, by emphasizing the 5 key principles, or what we might call the 5 core principles of the theory. These are really axioms, you might say, or they are descriptive claims that Petronio makes about the way people act with respect to private information. So, principle number 1. First of all, people believe they own and have a right to control their private information. So, there's information about yourself that you believe you own and have a right to control. It's no one else's right to control it but yours. One of the areas where Petronio's theory has been used again and again and again, and increasingly so, is in the medical arena. Because in the medical arena, we have all kinds of examples where people believe that their medical information is their own information. They alone have a right to control it and keep it private. You may recall at the beginning of the semester, I told you that I've been on the sideline dealing with some medical issues. I didn't tell you exactly what those were. And I chose to make that decision quite deliberately. I believe that medical information is mine. I have a right to it. I have a right to control it. It's private. I will choose to elaborate on that in more detail at the appropriate time, but that's my choice to do that. And so I have told several people along the way that, when I have given them some details about what I'm dealing with, I told them, well, this is not something I want you just to talk indiscriminately about with other people. This is my information. Please keep it private. My wife is a developmental therapist here in the Lafayette area. She works for First Steps of Indiana, and she has private clients. She has to be very careful when she talks to people. She can't just blurt out, "Oh, I'm seeing so and so," because that might imply that so and so has some need for therapy. That information is deemed to be private information. It's under their control. She can't simply blurt that out indiscriminately to somebody, and if she did, she could get into trouble. So the medical community has invoked a whole system of standards and ethics in order to honor this idea that when it comes to medical information, people believe they own and have a right to control that information themselves. Not only medical information, though, all kinds of other information, relationship information. So there's a whole host of types of information that you feel like you own and you have a right to control. Now, ownership implies both rights and obligations. There is an obligation if you come into contact with private information that you also have to abide by. We've had some very interesting national examples of people who have decided to share private information, but have been under a burden and an obligation to share that information in a particular way. So maybe time to stop the video, Doug, and take a show of hands here to see if anybody knows who this guy is. Who is Mark Felt, and what was his secret? Mark Felt had a very big secret, and he chose to reveal that important private information to just two people. And those two people knew that private information for decades before it was time to make it more public, or it was okay to make it more public. Mark Felt has now died, but it was before he died. The information did come out that he was the one who revealed this important private information to just two men. So I've given you a few clues. Does anybody know who Mark Felt is, who he was, and what his secret was? And Doug, I'll let you preside over that question for the class. Secondly, who is Edward Snowden, and what was his secret? Now, Edward Snowden is a more recent example, but he chose to reveal important private information to everyone. And what information was that, and why did he do it? My guess is that more of you know who Edward Snowden is than Mark Felt, because it's simply a more current example. But there were obligations involved in sharing this kind of private information, and both men, Mark Felt and Edward Snowden, felt those obligations and have had to deal with the consequences of those obligations of keeping that information private and sharing it in the way that they did. Secondly, the second core principle here is people control their private information through the use of personal privacy rules. So, when a person has private information, you want to set up some kind of system of rules to protect that information and share those rules. In my family, you know from a prior lecture that I grew up, my parents operated a Dunkin' Donut franchise in central New Jersey for 20 years, between 1964 and 1984. So I grew up in a family business. And there were lots of rules in the family, privacy rules, about information that the kids, I being one of those, could share and not share with the people who worked in the donut shop. So, for example, one privacy rule that we had as a family is that I was never to let the employees know where my parents were. The reason for that rule was that if the employees thought that my parents were out of town, if they thought that they were nowhere around and could not make an appearance in the donut shop, they might feel more free to serve their friends free donuts and coffee, or free donuts and Coke. Or they might feel more free to take a swipe at a $20 bill in the cash register without getting caught. So there was a good reason for the rule, but that was one of the rules. Another rule was we were never to divulge how much money the store was taking in during a given period of time. So if I knew that on a Saturday morning we took in $500, let's say, I was never to make that information public to any of the employees or to a customer to divulge that information. So we had a number of privacy rules that was designed to control the private information that we had. And one of Petronio's principles here is that people do control their private information through the use of these privacy rules that they come up with. Now, the third principle is the principle of co-ownership. When others are told or discover a person's private information, they become co-owners of that information. And as a co-owner, there is a tendency to feel a sense of responsibility for the information, but maybe not equal responsibility. And that can lead to a problem. So if a friend comes to you and shares some private information, you become a co-owner of that information. And Petronio believes that basically, as a co-owner of the information, you are responsible to the person who shared it with you to protect it in the way that that person wants it protected. In reality, though, a lot of co-owners, they may feel that sense of responsibility, but they may not feel it to the exact same degree as the person who shared the information with them. I can give you an example of that from the academic world right here at Purdue. This also illustrates the fact that sometimes we are not necessarily willing co-owners of information. But suppose a colleague comes to me and announces to me, as happened a couple of years ago, I'm planning on leaving Purdue. In fact, I have already accepted a position at another university. Well, as a faculty member in the Brian Lamb School, I recognize that information is extremely important information in planning the courses that are going to be taught in the following semester, in whether or not we are going to go to the dean and ask for another position to replace that person. But that person also says to me, hey, by the way, this is not to be shared. I am not ready to have this information out. It's private, so please don't tell anybody. Well, that is something that I might want to try to remain sensitive to and feel an obligation about. But as a good citizen of the department, I may not feel equal responsibility in protecting that person's private information because I know of the implications that it might have for the future of the school, which, after all, I'm going to be a part of, and this person who just shared the information with me is not. And so I may feel tempted to share that information with somebody else so that we can begin planning for this reality. That may get me into trouble if I did that, but it illustrates this idea that Petronio has that a co-owner may feel some responsibility for the information, but maybe not equal responsibility. It also, I think, illustrates this idea that sometimes we would rather not be the recipient of private information because of this kind of tension and obligation that it may put us under. So I asked earlier in the lecture, how many of you have private information right now that you wish you didn't have? That obligation puts you in an uncomfortable position. When I was the associate head of the Brian Lamb School a couple of years ago, it was not uncommon for somebody to show up at my door and say, boy, have I got something to tell you. And sometimes I would just throw up my arms and say, no, I don't want to hear it. Because I recognized that hearing it might place me under an obligation to protect private information that I really didn't feel very comfortable trying to protect. So sometimes I just would rather not hear something than to hear it and have to try to protect it. So this is one of the principles that leads to some of the interesting situations that Petronio addresses in privacy management theory, as people may not feel equal responsibility. Although Petronio tends to assert in her theory that it really is an ethical obligation of somebody who is the recipient of private information to feel that same sense of responsibility. She calls it a stewardship. You will hear in the interview that I have with her down in Indianapolis, you will hear her refer to this as a kind of a stewardship. The fourth important principle here is the importance of negotiation. Co-owners of private information need to negotiate mutually agreeable privacy rules about telling others. And so when a person comes to you and tells you some private information, one of your dilemmas initially may be, hey, wait a minute, who can I tell? Can I tell my best friend? Can I tell my wife? Can I tell my husband? How many times has somebody come to you and said, I've got some information and you can't tell anybody? Well, what does anybody mean? Does anybody mean my spouse? Does anybody mean my brother, my sister, my parents? Do you really mean anybody? And Petronio wants to emphasize here that it is very important to negotiate what she calls mutually agreeable rules about telling others. That process of negotiating collective boundaries may not be simple. So you may not want the information, and you end up getting it, and then after you get it, a person lays a privacy rule on you and tells you can't tell anybody, and your reaction might be, well, gee, if I had known that I can't tell anybody, I wouldn't have agreed to be told. You've now told me, I think I have to tell somebody about it. And that leads to conflict in a relationship. So the negotiation of privacy rules can lead to tension and what she calls turbulence, which we'll talk about in a minute, in a relationship. Petronio insists that it's really important to negotiate the privacy rules about telling other people. I asked her in the interview, and you'll see how she handled it, do you work out the rules before you tell a person or afterwards? So in other words, I could go to somebody and say, hey, look, I've got some information here about something, a situation. Before I tell you, I need to make sure that you will pledge to me not to tell anybody else. So you've probably had somebody come to you before and say, if I tell you something, can you promise not to tell anyone? And your reaction to that sometimes might be, well, it depends on what it is. And that's not an unreasonable answer. That is the beginning of a negotiation of the privacy rules. You're letting the person know that it might depend on the nature of the information, whether you are willing to keep it secret. And that opens up this negotiation process, which then can be hashed out. Petronio says that she doesn't have a sure pat answer for whether you work out the rules before you divulge the private information or afterwards. She simply says you got to work out the rules. And if you don't work out the rules, you run into this fifth core principle, where she says when co-owners of private information don't effectively negotiate and follow jointly held privacy rules, she says boundary turbulence is the likely result. And she uses the metaphor of a stormy sea to talk about relationship turbulence. Turbulence in a relationship can often be the outcome of the violation of privacy rules. So my guess is, again, if we ask for a show of hands, how many of you have experienced relationship difficulties because of the revelation of private information that somebody did not want revealed? How many of you can think of a situation in which that might be the case? Doug, you might want to stop the tape here and ask for some specific examples if people are willing to share instances where they experienced relationship turbulence over private information that got shared that was expected not to be shared. Those can be some interesting stories to tell and interesting examples. Petronio says that boundary turbulence can come from a couple of different sources. First of all, she says fuzzy boundaries. So maybe there was a fuzzy boundary in your negotiation where you thought that it was okay to tell somebody, but the person who shared the information with you did not think it was okay to tell that person. So it was a fuzzy boundary. There was just not a very clear understanding of what the boundary was. Oh, I thought it was okay to tell that person. I didn't know that you didn't want me to tell that person that information. So the boundary was simply fuzzy. It was not clearly negotiated. Petronio says, negotiate clear boundaries. Don't leave the boundaries fuzzy. Secondly, there can be intentional breaches. That is, somebody recognizes that the information they have may put them in a powerful position. They can hurt somebody by telling them that information, and maybe they want to hurt that person, and so they have an intentional breach. They know they're not supposed to tell somebody, but they do it anyway for their own selfish reasons or otherwise. And then thirdly, there can just be mistakes. So sometimes what happens is people have private information and they forget that it's private. They may blurt it out and spill the beans in a way that's not intentional. It's not deliberate. It's not because the boundaries were not effectively negotiated. It's simply a mistake. all three of those situations can lead to boundary turbulence, and maybe people in the class have examples of a fuzzy boundary situation, an intentional breach, or a mistake that they're willing to talk about and share. But these are the 5 core principles of the theory, and I think you can see as we've gone through this today, it really provides a vocabulary to talk about private information, and that is the main contribution of this theory that I think leads to the fact that it has been so widely used and is so popular. Again, literally hundreds of articles about privacy management theory. Okay, that's really all I have to say about the theory. I'd like to end today by playing you the interview that I had with Sandra Petronio, where I went down and asked her a number of questions about the theory and got her to give answers in her own words. And you can hear her talking about some of these concepts and how she articulates some of these ideas herself in a very spontaneous and casual setting. This was a very fun interview to do. She was really well prepared for it, and she was very happy with the outcome. So, Doug, you could run this interview. Great being with you again today, and I'm doing well, by the way, and still hoping to make personal contact with you before the end of the semester for sure, and hope that happens at some point. Thanks a lot.